Mark Johnson had worked his entire life for this moment. After years of saving and planning, he'd finally purchased Henderson's Hardware, a struggling store in the small town of Riverdale. But before announcing himself as the new owner, Mark decided to visit as a regular customer first. What he didn't expect was to be accused of suspicious behavior and thrown out of his own store by the manager, Karen Williams. Now, Mark has a choice to make: reveal his identity immediately, or use this painful experience to uncover the deeper problems at Henderson's Hardware. As he checks into the Riverdale Inn and prepares for tomorrow's visit, Mark has no idea that his connection to Karen and this small town runs deeper than either of them realizes. "Welcome to Riverdale," he whispered to his reflection in the window. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." Mark Johnson looked out the window of his rental car as he drove past the "Welcome to Riverdale" sign. His heart beat a little faster. After months of planning, he was finally here. Population 8,742. Mark read aloud. "Seems about right." The small town looked just like the pictures he'd seen online. Main Street had old brick buildings with colorful signs. People walked in and out of shops. Some sat on benches eating ice cream, even though it was only April. Mark drove slowly, taking it all in. Riverdale was very different from Chicago, where he'd lived his whole life. It was quieter here, smaller, and, Mark noticed, much less diverse. Most of the people he passed were white. He parked near the town square and checked his phone. His hotel was just 2 blocks away. But what he really wanted to see was a few streets over. Henderson's Hardware, the store he now owned. Mark smiled at the thought. He'd worked so hard for this moment. From his first job stocking shelves as a teenager to business school at night while working full-time. Now, at 35, he had finally saved enough to buy his own business. When Henderson's Hardware came up for sale, Mark knew it was perfect. The store had been in Riverdale for over 50 years, but it was struggling. The owner wanted to retire, and his children weren't interested in running it. Mark saw the potential right away. He got out of his car and stretched. The drive from Chicago had taken almost 6 hours. As he grabbed his suitcase from the trunk, he felt someone watching him. An older woman across the street stared at him with narrow eyes. Mark smiled and waved. She didn't wave back. "Not the warmest welcome," Mark muttered to himself. But he wasn't surprised. He'd faced much worse. The Riverdale Inn was a 3-story brick building with flower boxes in the windows. Inside, the lobby was cozy, with old photos of the town on the walls. A gray-haired man stood behind the desk. "Good afternoon," the man said. "Welcome to Riverdale Inn. Checking in?" "Yes, sir. Mark Johnson. I have a reservation for 2 weeks." The man typed on his computer. "Ah, here you are, Mr. Johnson. Business or pleasure?" "Business," Mark said. "I'm here to consult on a local store." Mark wasn't ready to tell anyone he was the new owner of Henderson's Hardware. Not yet. He wanted to see how the store operated first. He wanted to know how customers were treated, especially customers who looked like him. "Wonderful," the man said, handing Mark a key. "Room 204, up the stairs and to the right. Breakfast is served from 6 to 9 a.m. My name's Paul if you need anything." "Thanks, Paul. Actually, I do have a question." Mark leaned forward. "I was hoping to visit Henderson's Hardware while I'm here. Do you know when they're open?" Paul smiled. "Henderson's? Sure, they're open until 6 today. It's about a 5-minute walk from here. Been there forever. Old man Henderson still runs it, but the place isn't what it used to be. Still good people, though." Mark nodded. "I'll check it out tomorrow. Thanks." In his room, Mark unpacked quickly. It was a simple space, with a bed, desk, and small bathroom. He opened his laptop and reviewed the notes from his last call with Richard Henderson, the current owner. Richard didn't know Mark's plan. Mark had told him he wanted to observe the store operations before making big changes. Richard agreed to introduce Mark as a business consultant, not the new owner. This way, Mark could see how things really worked. Mark had done his homework. Henderson's Hardware had been losing money for years. Online reviews were mixed. Some loved the store's history and selection. Others complained about poor customer service and outdated inventory. Mark wanted to fix all of that. He planned to update the store while keeping its small-town charm. He would improve the inventory, train the staff, and create a welcoming place for everyone. He looked at the list of current employees, 6 in total, including the manager, Karen Williams. Richard had spoken highly of Karen, saying she'd worked there for 15 years and knew the business inside out. Mark was excited to meet them all tomorrow as a consultant. But first, he would visit as a customer. He wanted to see how they treated people when they didn't know the boss was watching. After a quick dinner at a diner across the street, Mark returned to his room and called his sister, Tanya. "I made it," he told her. "The town is pretty much what we expected." "Have you seen the store yet?" Tanya asked. "Not yet. I'll go tomorrow morning, just to look around. The official meeting with the staff isn't until the afternoon. And they still don't know you're the owner?" "No," Mark said, "and I want to keep it that way for now." "Be careful, Mark," Tanya said, her voice serious. "You know how these small towns can be." Mark sighed. I know. But this is business, Tanya, and it's a good investment." "I hope so," she said. "I don't want you calling me about some small-town drama." Mark laughed. "No drama, I promise." After they hung up, Mark stood at the window, looking down at Manning Street as it grew dark. Stores closed for the night. Cars drove past slowly. It seemed peaceful. Tomorrow, he would walk into Henderson's Hardware as just another customer. Would they welcome him? Would they follow him around the store? Would they see a potential thief instead of a potential buyer? Mark had faced these questions his whole life, in stores all over Chicago. But this time was different. This time, he owned the place. He took a deep breath. "A new start," he said to himself, "for me and for that store." Outside, the Riverdale town clock chimed 8 times. In 12 hours, Mark would walk through the doors of a business he owned, but where nobody knew his name. "Welcome to Riverdale," he whispered to his reflection in the window. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." The next morning, Mark woke up early. Sunlight streamed through the curtains as he got ready for his first visit to Henderson's Hardware. He chose his clothes carefully, just jeans, sneakers, and a plain blue t-shirt. Nothing fancy. Today, he wasn't Mark Johnson, the businessman. He was just another customer. After breakfast at the inn, Mark walked the 5 blocks to Henderson's Hardware. The morning was cool and bright. People nodded politely as they passed, though some gave him curious looks. Mark was used to being noticed in places where there weren't many black faces. When he turned onto Oak Street, he saw it. Henderson's Hardware took up almost half the block. The red brick building had large windows with faded signs advertising tools and paint. The store name hung above the entrance in big, chipped letters. Not exactly inviting, Mark thought, but he could already see how to make it better. Fresh paint, new signs, better lighting. The place had potential. Mark took a deep breath and pushed open the door. A bell jingled as he stepped inside. The smell hit him first, dust mixed with metal and wood. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt old. The store was bigger than it looked from outside. Tall shelves created narrow aisles filled with tools, hardware, and home supplies. Most of the shelves needed restocking. Some were almost empty. Only two other customers browsed the store, an older man in overalls and a middle-aged woman looking at paint samples. Behind the counter, a young man with red hair was helping the woman. He glanced up when Mark entered, then went back to explaining paint options. Mark walked slowly through the aisles, noting what needed improvement. The inventory was outdated. The displays were messy, and everything needed a good dusting. In the back of the store, Mark found the power tools section. This was what he really wanted to see. Power tools were expensive and popular, a good way to judge how the store was doing. The selection was decent, but not great. Many models were several years old. Mark picked up a cordless drill and checked the price tag. It was marked $20 higher than the same model online. No wonder the store was struggling. As he examined the drill, Mark felt someone watching him. He looked up to see a woman staring at him from the end of the aisle. She was in her 40s with short blonde hair and wore a blue vest with Henderson's Hardware embroidered on it. Karen Williams. It had to be. The store manager Richard had mentioned. Mark smiled at her. "Good morning." Karen didn't smile back. "Can I help you find something?" Her voice was stiff. "Just looking at your power tools," Mark said, still holding the drill. "I'm thinking about some home projects." Karen stepped closer. "That's an expensive model. One of our best?" "It's nice," Mark agreed. "A bit overpriced compared to online, though?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "We offer personal service. You can't get that online." "True," Mark said. He put the drill down and picked up another one. "How about this one? Is it reliable?" Instead of answering his question, Karen moved even closer. "What kind of project are you working on, exactly?" Mark felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd been through this before. "Just some shelving at home. Nothing complicated." Karen said. She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "We've had some issues with theft lately, especially with the pricier items." Mark put the drill down. "I'm not planning to steal anything. I'm just shopping." "Of course," Karen said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But you've been holding those drills for quite a while, and you're not from around here, are you?" The tightness in Mark's chest turned to anger. He worked to keep his voice calm. "I'm new in town. Just moved here." "Really? Where are you staying?" Karen crossed her arms. Mark noticed the red-haired clerk watching them now. The other customers, too. "I'm at the Riverdale Inn," he said. "The inn?" Karen raised her eyebrows. "That's rather expensive for someone just passing through." Mark knew exactly what she meant. She couldn't imagine he could afford to stay there. She couldn't imagine he might be a successful businessman. All she saw was his skin color. "I think I've seen enough," Mark said. He moved to walk past her. Karen stepped into his path. "I'd like you to leave the store now." Mark stared at her in disbelief. "Excuse me?" I said. "I'd like you to leave." Karen's voice was louder now. "I have the right to refuse service to anyone who makes me uncomfortable." "Makes you uncomfortable," Mark repeated. "I haven't done anything." "Sir, please don't raise your voice," Karen said, though Mark hadn't. "If you don't leave, I'll call the police." The store had gone completely quiet. The other customers watched, but said nothing. The red-haired clerk looked uncomfortable, but didn't step in. Mark felt the familiar mix of humiliation and rage. He thought of revealing who he was right then, telling this woman that he actually owned the store she was throwing him out of. But something held him back. This wasn't just about him. This was about how the store treated customers. All customers. Fine, Mark said finally. I'll go. But this isn't right. And you know it. Karen didn't respond. She just watched as Mark walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, he heard her say to the clerk, "Watch him until he's gone." Outside, Mark stood on the sidewalk, his hands shaking with anger. He'd been planning to buy this store for months, had dreamed about making it successful, and on his very first visit, he'd been treated like a criminal. For a moment, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe Tanya was right. Maybe this small town wasn't ready for someone like him. Then his resolve hardened. He hadn't worked this hard to give up now. If anything, what just happened proved how much Henderson's hardware needed to change. Mark checked his watch. His official meeting with Richard and the staff was in 3 hours. He'd be introduced as a consultant, not the owner. And Karen Williams had no idea that the man she'd just thrown out of the store would soon be her boss. "Game on," Mark whispered, as he walked away from Henderson's hardware. This just got personal. Mark strode back to the Riverdale Inn, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to call Richard Henderson right now and tell him everything. Another part wanted to cancel the whole deal. But the businessman in him knew better. He needed facts, not just feelings. In his room, Mark paced back and forth. The encounter with Karen kept replaying in his head. Her suspicious looks, her accusation, the way the other customers just watched. "I need to calm down," he told himself. He sat on the edge of the bed and took deep breaths. When he felt steadier, Mark picked up his phone and called his friend Jamal. They had met in business school and stayed close over the years. "Hey man," Jamal answered. "How's small-town life?" "It's..." Mark paused. "Educational?" Uh-oh. What happened? Mark explained his visit to Henderson's hardware and how Karen had treated him. As he talked, his anger returned. "That's messed up," Jamal said when Mark finished. "But not surprising, right? We've both been through this before." "Yeah," Mark agreed. "But this is my store now, Jamal. Or it will be officially next week. And I need to know if this is how they treat all black customers or if it was just me." Jamal was quiet for a moment. "You need more data points." "Exactly," Mark said. "I need to see if other people get the same treatment." "You know," Jamal said slowly, "I could help with that. I've got a meeting in Springfield tomorrow. That's only an hour from Riverdale, right? I could swing by." Mark sat up straighter. "That would be perfect. But we need more than just you." "What? About Lisa from marketing? And maybe David from IT?" Jamal suggested. "Lisa's Latina and David's Asian. They both owe me favors. You think they'd drive all that way to help me out? For you?" "Absolutely," Jamal said. "Plus, Lisa's been wanting to try that famous pie place near you. What's it called?" "Betty's Bakery," Mark said, remembering the colorful shop he'd passed on Main Street. "Right. I'll tell her there's pie involved. She'll be there." By the end of the call, they had a plan. The next morning, Jamal, Lisa, and David would visit Henderson's hardware at different times. They would browse the same power tool section where Mark had been confronted. They would each pick up the same drill, and they would see what happened. Mark also called his sister Tanya and asked her to find 2 white friends who could do the same test. By early afternoon, everything was arranged. Mark felt better having a plan, but he still dreaded his upcoming meeting at the store. How would he face Karen without showing his anger? How would he pretend to be just a consultant when he'd been treated so poorly as a customer? At exactly 3 o'clock, Mark walked back to Henderson's hardware. This time, he wore a business suit and carried a leather briefcase. He looked every inch the professional consultant. The same bell jingled as he entered the store. The red-haired clerk looked up and did a double-take, clearly recognizing Mark from earlier. Before he could say anything, an older man approached. With a big smile, "You must be Mark Johnson." The man extended his hand. "I'm Richard Henderson. So glad you're here to help us turn this place around." Mark shook his hand. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Henderson. Please, call me Richard. Let me introduce you to the team." Richard led Mark to the back of the store where 4 employees had gathered, including the red-haired clerk and Karen Williams. "Everyone, this is Mark Johnson. He's the business consultant I told you about. He'll be working with us for the next 2 weeks to help improve our operations." Karen stared at Mark with a puzzled expression. She clearly didn't recognize him from that morning. The suit, the briefcase, the different context. He looked like a completely different person to her. "Mark, this is our team. Mike is our newest employee." Richard pointed to the red-haired clerk. "That's Tom and Betty, who handle stocking and inventory. And this is Karen Williams, our store manager. She's been with us for 15 years. I don't know what I'd do without her." Karen stepped forward with a professional smile. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Johnson. Richard speaks very highly of your consulting skills." She offered her hand, and Mark shook it, fighting to keep his expression neutral. She had no idea she'd thrown the new owner out of his own store just hours earlier. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you," Mark said, looking each employee in the eye. "I think together we can make Henderson's Hardware the best store in Riverdale again." Richard beamed. "That's the spirit. Karen, why don't you show Mark around? Explain how everything works." "Of course," Karen said. "Follow me, Mr. Johnson." As Mark followed Karen through the store that was now secretly his, he thought about tomorrow. About his friends testing how the staff really treated customers. About the evidence he would gather, "Particularly interested in your customer service approach," Mark told Karen. "It's often the most important factor in a store's success." Karen nodded confidently. "Customer service is my specialty, Mr. Johnson. I'm sure you'll be impressed." Mark just smiled. Tomorrow would reveal the truth. Karen's tour of Henderson's Hardware was thorough but revealed many problems. Inventory was poorly organized. The computer system was outdated, and the back room was a mess of boxes and unsorted merchandise. "We do the best we can with what we have," Karen explained as they walked through the cluttered storage area. "Richard hasn't invested much in upgrades lately." Mark nodded, taking notes on his tablet. "What about staffing? Do you feel you have enough people?" "We could use more help, especially on weekends," Karen admitted. "But Richard is careful with the budget." "I understand," Mark said. "And what about diversity? I notice all the current staff are white." Karen finished his sentence. "Well, this is Riverdale. The applicant pool isn't exactly diverse." Mark made another note. "But Riverdale does have people of color living here, correct?" Karen shrugged. "Some. Not many apply to work here." She quickly changed the subject. "Let me introduce you to the rest of the team individually. You'll need to know everyone's strengths and weaknesses." Over the next 2 hours, Mark sat in the small break room and talked with each employee. Betty, the inventory manager, was in her 50s and had worked at the store for 20 years. She knew where everything was but seemed resistant to change. "We've always done it this way," she said when Mark asked about updating the inventory system. "Why fix what isn't broken?" Tom, the stockroom manager, was more open to new ideas. "This place needs a complete overhaul," he told Mark. "I've been saying it for years, but nobody listens." The most interesting conversation was with Mike, the young red-haired clerk. At first, Mike seemed nervous and kept glancing at the door as if afraid someone might overhear. "How long have you worked here, Mike?" Mark asked. Just 6 months, Mike said. It's my first job after college. And how do you like it? Mike hesitated. It's educational. Mark smiled at hearing his own word from earlier. Educational how? Let's just say I've learned a lot about people, Mike said carefully. About how differently they can treat each other. Before Mark could ask more questions, Karen appeared in the doorway. Mike, we need you at the register. Mrs. Peterson is here for her special order. Mike stood quickly. Yes, ma'am. As he left, he gave Mark a meaningful look. That kid knows something, Mark thought. At the end of the day, Richard invited Mark to dinner at Riverdale Steakhouse, the fanciest restaurant in town. Over steaks and potatoes, they discussed the store's finances. We're not in immediate danger, Richard explained, but profits have been declining for years. That's why I'm selling. And the new owner? Mark asked casually. What do you know about him? Richard looked uncomfortable. Not much, honestly. The sale was handled through lawyers. I know he's from Chicago and has a business background. He seemed nice enough on the phone. I see, Mark said. And have you told the staff about the sale? Not yet, Richard admitted. I'm waiting until it's finalized next week. Karen will take it the hardest. She's been hoping to buy the store herself someday, but she could never get the financing together. Mark nearly choked on his water. Karen wanted to buy Henderson's? Richard nodded. She's dedicated to that store, almost obsessively. When she heard I was selling, she tried to get a loan. But no bank would back her. She's been different since then. More controlling at the store. This was new information. Mark wondered how it might explain Karen's behavior. Tell me more about Karen, Mark said. She seems very protective of the store. Richard sighed. Karen's my niece, actually. My sister's daughter. She's had a tough life. Divorced twice. Raised 2 kids on her own. The store has been her one constant. And you trust her completely? Of course, Richard said without hesitation. She runs that place better than I ever did. The customers love her. Some customers, Mark thought, but didn't say. Back at the Riverdale Inn, Mark found an envelope that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a handwritten note. Mr. Johnson, I think we need to talk privately. There are things about the store you should know. Meet me at Donna's Diner tomorrow at 7 a.m. if interested. Mike, Mark smiled. The young clerk was braver than he looked. His phone buzzed with a text from Jamal. All set for tomorrow. Operation Hardware Store is a go. Mark texted back, perfect. Just act natural. Buy something small if you can. He set his phone down and stared out the window at the dark, quiet street. Tomorrow would be revealing in more ways than one. The next morning, Mark arrived at Donna's Diner at 6:45 a.m. The small restaurant was already busy with the breakfast crowd, mostly workers grabbing coffee and eggs before their shifts. Mark chose a booth in the back corner. At exactly 7:02, Mike walked in, looking nervous. He spotted Mark and hurried over. Thanks for meeting me, Mike said, sliding into the booth. I don't have much time. My shift starts at 8 hours. No problem, Mark said. What did you want to tell me? Mike leaned forward and lowered his voice. It's about Karen and how she treats certain customers. I'm listening, Mark said, trying not to show too much eagerness. She profiles people, Mike said bluntly, especially black customers, follows them around, questions them, sometimes asks them to leave, claiming they look suspicious. Has anyone complained? Mark asked. A few have. Richard ignores it. She's family, so... Mike shrugged. And the other staff? Do they feel the same way Karen does? Mike shook his head. Betty doesn't seem to notice. Tom sees it but doesn't want to rock the boat. He needs the job. And me? He hesitated. My mom's black. My dad's white. Karen doesn't know that. I pass as white, so she said things around me she probably wouldn't otherwise. Mark nodded slowly. This explained Mike's earlier discomfort. Why are you telling me this? Because someone needs to, Mike said simply. And you seem like someone who might actually do something about it. He glanced at his watch. I should go. Karen gets suspicious if I'm late. As Mike stood to leave, Mark stopped him. One more question. Do you like working there? At Henderson's? Mike thought for a moment. I like the store. I like helping people find what they need. But the atmosphere, it needs to change. After Mike left, Mark sat alone, drinking his coffee and thinking. Between what Richard had shared and what Mike had just revealed, the picture was becoming clearer. Henderson's hardware had serious problems, and they went far beyond outdated. Inventory. Mark checked his watch. In 1 hour, Jamal would be the first to visit the store. Then Lisa and David would follow. By afternoon, Mark would have the evidence he needed. The bell above the diner door jingled as new customers entered. Mark looked up and saw Karen Williams walk in with Betty from the store. They hadn't noticed him yet. Mark slid lower in his booth. The last thing he needed was an awkward encounter before his plan was in motion, especially when the truth was so close to being revealed. Mark held his breath as Karen and Betty found a table on the other side of the diner. Luckily, their backs were to him. He could hear bits of their conversation, something about a shipment of lawnmowers coming next week. After paying for his coffee, Mark slipped out quietly. He had work to do before heading to the store later. Back at the inn, Mark received texts from his friends throughout the morning. Each described their visit to Henderson's hardware in detail. Jamal went first. Just left the store. Karen followed. Me the entire time. When I picked up that drill, she immediately asked if I needed help. Her tone wasn't friendly. When I said I was just looking, she said, "These are expensive items." I felt like she was accusing me of something. She stayed within 5 feet of me until I left. An hour later, Lisa texted, "Finished my visit. No one followed me around, but Karen watched me from behind the counter. When I asked about the drill's battery life, she answered quickly and walked away. Not friendly, but not hostile either." David's experience was next. Karen was busy with another customer when I arrived. Mike helped me instead. Very friendly kid. I asked about the same drill. He was helpful and didn't hover. Karen glanced over a few times but didn't approach. Finally, Mark received reports from Tanya's white friends, Jeff and Sarah. Both had very different experiences. Jeff wrote, "Karen was super helpful, showed me different models, offered a discount on the drill, and even carried it to the counter for me. Completely different from what you described." Sarah had a similar experience. Karen spent 15 minutes with me going over all the features. She even suggested I could put it on hold if my husband wanted to come see it first. A bit sexist, but definitely not suspicious of me. The evidence was clear. Karen treated customers differently based on how they looked. Mark wasn't surprised, but seeing it confirmed still made him angry. Around noon, Mark arrived at Henderson's Hardware for his second day as a consultant. He nodded politely to Karen at the front counter. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she said. "Richard had to run errands today. He asked me to help you with anything you need." "Perfect," Mark said. "I'd like to observe customer interactions today. Just pretend I'm not here." Karen seemed uncomfortable with this idea. "Observe? You mean watch me work?" And the other? Staff, Mark added. I need to understand the customer experience from start to finish. For the next few hours, Mark sat quietly in different parts of the store, taking notes. What he saw was revealing. Karen had two completely different personalities depending on who walked through the door. When elderly white customers came in, Karen was patient and helpful. She escorted Mrs. Wilson around the store for 30 minutes, helping her find the perfect bird feeder. She joked with Mr. Cooper about his never-ending bathroom renovation. She even offered to carry packages to cars for several older shoppers. But when a young black woman came in looking for paint, Karen's demeanor changed instantly. Her smile disappeared. Her answers became short. She didn't offer to mix the paint or carry it to the car. She watched the woman from a distance, pretending to straighten items on nearby shelves. The pattern was consistent all day. White customers received warm, personal service. Customers of color received cold, minimal help, if they weren't outright ignored or watched suspiciously. What made it worse was hearing Karen brag about her customer service during their lunch break. The personal touch is what keeps people coming back, she told Mark as they ate sandwiches in the break room. I know most of our regulars by name. I noticed that, Mark said carefully. But what about new customers? People who aren't regulars? Yet? Karen shrugged. You have to be careful with strangers these days, especially in retail. Theft is a big problem. Has Henderson's had many shoplifting incidents? Mark asked. Well, no, Karen admitted. But that's because I'm vigilant. I see, Mark said, writing in his notebook. And how do you decide which customers might be problematic? Karen stiffened. It's just instinct, experience. You develop a sense for these things. Mark nodded but said nothing more. Her instinct was clearly biased. Later that afternoon, Richard returned to the store. Mark asked to see the customer. Complaint records. Complaints? Richard seemed surprised. We don't get many complaints. You must have some system for tracking customer feedback, Mark pressed. Well, there's a suggestion box. Richard pointed to a dusty wooden box near the register. Karen empties it and handles any issues. Of course she does, Mark thought. When Richard stepped away, Mark quietly asked Mike about the suggestion box. It's a joke, Mike whispered. Karen throws away anything negative. I've seen her do it. Has anyone ever complained about how they were treated? Mark asked. Mike nodded. A few months ago, a black family wrote that they felt unwelcome. Karen ripped it up and said they were just looking for something to complain about. Mark wasn't surprised. Are there any complaints she couldn't ignore? Ones that went directly to Richard? There was one, Mike said. A professor from the community college. He's black. Karen accused him of stealing and called the police. Turned out he had the receipt in his pocket. He wrote a formal complaint letter to Richard. What happened? Richard talked to Karen. She said it was an honest mistake. That was it. Mike shook his head. Nothing changed. By the end of the day, Mark had a clear picture of Henderson's Hardware's biggest problem. It wasn't the inventory or the outdated systems. It was Karen Williams and the toxic environment she created. But Mark also understood something else. Now, Karen wasn't just a manager. She was family. And she'd wanted to own the store herself. How would she react when she learned the truth about him? As Mark left that evening, he saw Karen in the office looking at old photo albums. For a moment, she seemed sad, vulnerable even. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before. Mark reminded himself that people were complicated. Understanding Karen's behavior didn't excuse it. But if he wanted to fix Henderson's Hardware, he needed to understand all sides of its manager. Tomorrow, he would explore the town and learn more about the community Henderson's was supposed to serve. The community that Karen was driving away, one customer at a time. Mark woke up early the next morning. Richard had given him the day off to review his notes, but Mark had different plans. Today, he would explore Riverdale and meet the people who should be shopping at Henderson's Hardware. After breakfast, Mark started his walk through town. Riverdale was larger than it first appeared. Beyond Main Street and the town square, neighborhoods spread out in all directions. The east side of town had big houses with neat lawns. The west side had smaller homes, some needing repair. Mark noticed right away that the west side was more diverse. He saw black families, Latino couples, and Asian kids playing in the yards. Mark stopped at a small park where a group of men were playing chess. One of them, an older black man with gray hair, waved him over. "You're new in town," the man said. It wasn't a question. Mark nodded. "Just arrived a few days ago. My name's Mark Johnson." "Calvin Washington," the man said, shaking Mark's hand. "What brings you to Riverdale?" "Business," Mark said, keeping it vague. "I'm interested in local stores," Calvin chuckled. "Well, you picked an interesting time. Riverdale's changing. Used to be we all shopped on Main Street. Now, most folks drive to the big stores in Springfield." "Why's that?" Mark asked, though he suspected the answer. Calvin gave him a knowing look. "Some places are more welcoming than others. Take Henderson's Hardware. Used to be the best store in town. Old Mr. Henderson treated everyone the same. But these days," he shook his head. "These days?" Mark prompted. "Let's just say some of us don't feel welcome there anymore." Calvin moved his chess piece. "Checkmate, Joe," the other player groaned. "Every time." Mark spent another hour talking with the men. They told him about Riverdale's history, its changing neighborhoods, and which businesses they supported. "Betty's Bakery treats everyone right," Calvin said. "And the bookstore, too. But some places—" He didn't finish his thought. Next, Mark visited the West Side businesses. The shops were smaller than on Main Street, but busy. At Ramirez Grocery, he met Elena, the owner. "5 years in business," she said proudly when Mark introduced himself. "We serve the whole community, but especially people from this neighborhood." "Do many of your customers shop at Henderson's Hardware?" Mark asked. Elena's smile faded. "Not anymore. There was an incident last year with Mrs. Williams. She accused my son of stealing. He was just looking at fishing gear for his birthday." She shook her head. After that, most families around here stopped going there. Mark heard similar stories all day. Henderson's Hardware had once been loved by everyone in Riverdale. Now, a large part of the community avoided it. By late afternoon, Mark was hungry. He stopped at a diner called Sarah's Place on the edge of town. It was small but clean, with booths along the windows and a counter with stools. A young woman with curly brown hair greeted him. "Sit anywhere you like. I'm Sarah." "Mark," he replied, choosing a booth by the window. "Are you the owner?" Sarah laughed. "Yep. Opened 2 years ago, after saving every penny from waitressing." She handed him a menu. "What brings you to town?" "I'm working as a consultant at Henderson's Hardware," Mark said. Sarah's friendly smile dimmed slightly. "Henderson's? That place used to be special." "Used to be?" Sarah sat down across from him. The diner was empty except for an elderly couple in the corner. "My dad worked there for 20 years. Best job he ever had. Mr. Henderson, the current owner's father, gave him a chance when nobody else would hire a black man with no experience." "What happened?" Mark asked. "Dad retired. The older Mr. Henderson passed away. Things changed." Sarah shrugged. "Now it's just another store where some people get treated better than others." "Have you experienced that yourself?" Mark asked carefully. Sarah nodded. "Last time I went in for light bulbs, The manager followed me around like I was going to steal something. I haven't been back." She stood up. "Anyway, our special today is meatloaf. It's my grandmother's recipe." As Mark ate his dinner, the meatloaf was indeed excellent. He thought about all he'd learned. Henderson's Hardware wasn't just losing business. It was losing its place in the community. It had once been a store that brought people together. Now, it was driving them apart. Back at the inn that evening, Mark opened his laptop and began a new document titled Henderson's Hardware Community Outreach Plan. He worked late into the night, listing ideas for events, hiring practices, and training programs. The store needed more than new inventory and better displays. It needed to rebuild trust. Mark would have to decide what to do about Karen. But first, he needed a plan for the store itself. As he finally closed his laptop around midnight, Mark felt determined. Henderson's Hardware could be great again. It could serve all of Riverdale. He just had to make it happen. The next morning, Mark arrived at Henderson's Hardware early. He wanted time alone in the store before everyone else arrived. Richard had given him a key saying, "You might need to check things when we're not open." The empty store was peaceful. Mark walked slowly through each aisle, imagining how it could look. In his mind, he could see new displays, better lighting, and a more welcoming layout. But the physical changes were just the beginning. Mark sat at the old desk in Richard's office and reviewed his notes from last night. His plan had three main parts. First, update the store itself, new inventory, better technology, and a fresh look. Second, change the hiring practices to build a staff that reflected the whole community. Third, and most important, create a new store culture where everyone felt welcome. The third part would be the hardest, especially with Karen as manager. The bell above the door jingled. Mark checked his watch. 7:30 a.m. The store didn't open until 9. Whoa, hello? Mike's voice called out. "Back here," Mark answered. Mike appeared in the office doorway. "Sorry, I saw the lights on. Didn't know anyone would be here yet." "Just getting an early start," Mark said. "You're here early too." Mike nodded. "Karen asked me to restock the paint section before opening. Said I didn't do it right yesterday." Mark gestured to a chair. "Sit for a minute. I'd like your opinion." "On something?" Hesitantly, Mike sat down. Mark showed him his community outreach plan. "What do you think?" Mark asked after Mike had read it. "Would these changes help?" Mike's eyes were wide. "This is amazing! Community workshops? Staff from different backgrounds? A section of the store dedicated to local makers?" He looked up at Mark. "Richard approved all this?" "Not yet," Mark admitted. "I'm still developing the plan." "Karen will hate it," Mike said, "especially the diverse hiring part." "What about the rest of the staff?" Mike thought for a moment. "Tom would support it. Betty might be skeptical, but would come around if sales improved." He handed the paper back to Mark. "I think it's great, but I don't understand why you're putting so much effort into this. You're just a consultant, right? Once your 2 weeks are up, you'll move on to the next job." Mark smiled. "Let's just say I have a special interest in this store." Before Mike could ask more questions, they heard the front door open again. Mike jumped up. "That's probably Karen. I should get to work." After Mike left, Mark continued developing his plan. He created a budget, a timeline, and a list of potential community partners. He was so focused that he didn't hear Karen enter the office. "You're here early, Mr. Johnson," she said, making him jump. "Just catching up on some work," Mark said, closing his laptop. Karen's eyes narrowed. "What kind of work requires you to be here before opening?" "Store assessment," Mark said smoothly. It's easier to evaluate the layout when customers aren't present. Karen didn't look convinced, but she nodded. Richard wants to meet with you at lunch. He's curious about your findings so far. After Karen left, Mark spent the morning observing again. He paid special attention to how the current staff interacted with each other. Tom and Mike seemed friendly. Betty kept to herself, and everyone was careful around Karen. At noon, Richard took Mark to the diner across the street. Over sandwiches, Mark shared some of his ideas, but not all of them. He mentioned updating inventory and improving displays, but said nothing about community outreach or changing the staff. "I like what I'm hearing," Richard said. "Simple changes that could boost sales quickly." "There's more," Mark said, "but I'm still working on the details." Richard nodded. "Take your time. You've still got more than a week before the new owner takes over." He lowered his voice. "Between us, I'm getting nervous about that. What if he changes everything? Some of these people have worked for me for years." Mark felt a twinge of guilt. "Change isn't always bad," he said carefully. "The right changes could make the store better for everyone, customers and employees." Back at the store, Mark decided to check the security camera system. If Karen was profiling customers, there might be evidence on video. He found the small security office at the back of the store. Inside, an outdated computer connected to 4 cameras. Mark sat down and began reviewing footage from the past week. It was just as he expected. The videos clearly showed Karen's different behavior with different customers. "What are you doing?" Mark turned to find Mike standing in the doorway, looking confused. "Research," Mark said simply. Mike closed the door behind him. "That's not consultant work. That's—" He stopped, staring at Mark. "Who are you really?" Mark considered his options. Mike had been honest with him. Maybe it was time for some honesty in return. "This isn't just any consulting job for me," Mark admitted. "I care about what happens to this store." Mike crossed his arms. "Why? What's Henderson's Hardware to you?" Mark took a deep breath. He couldn't tell Mike everything, but he could share some of the truth. "I believe this store could be important to Riverdale again. It could bring people together instead of driving them apart. But that would take real changes." "Like the ones in your plan?" Mike asked. "Exactly." Mark turned back to the security footage. "But first, I need to understand exactly what's happening here." Mike was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up a chair next to Mark. "Let me help. I know which days had incidents." He pointed to dates on the computer. "Check these. They're the worst examples." For the next hour, Mark and Mike reviewed footage together. They documented times when Karen followed customers, questioned them unnecessarily, or treated them differently based on their appearance. "I knew it was bad," Mike said finally. "But seeing it all together like this, it's a pattern," Mark finished. "Clear discrimination." Mike looked at Mark with new understanding. "You're not just here to help the store make more money, are you?" Mark shook his head. "No, I'm not." "Then why—" Mike started, but the door suddenly opened. Karen stood there, her face flushed with anger. "What is going on here? Who gave you permission to access our security system?" Mark and Mike exchanged quick glances. Mike looked terrified, but Mark remained calm. "As a consultant, I need to review all aspects of the business," Mark said, standing up. "That includes security." Karen stepped into the small room. "Security footage is confidential. Richard didn't authorize this." "Actually, he did," Mark replied. "He gave me full access to all store systems." Karen crossed her arms. "And why is Mike here, instead of restocking shelves like I asked?" "Before Mike could stammer an excuse," Mark answered, "I requested his help. He knows the system better than I do." Karen didn't look convinced. "What exactly are you looking for in our security footage, Mr. Johnson?" Mark decided it was time to be direct. "I'm reviewing how customers are treated in this store." "All customers?" Karen's face flushed deeper. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Mark said. "I'm stating facts. The footage shows clear patterns of discrimination against customers of color." Mike stared at the floor, clearly wishing he could disappear. "That's ridiculous," Karen snapped. "I treat everyone the same." Mark pointed to the screen. "The evidence suggests otherwise. You follow some customers but not others. You question some customers' ability to afford items but not others. You offer help to some but watch others with suspicion." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You've been here, what, 5 days? And you think you understand this business better than someone who's been here 15 years? "I understand customer service," Mark replied. "And I understand discrimination when I see it." "How dare you?" Karen's voice rose. "You have no right to accuse me of—" "I'm not just accusing," Mark interrupted, keeping his voice level. "I'm showing you evidence." He turned to the computer and played a clip from yesterday. It showed Karen warmly greeting an elderly white couple, then immediately afterward watching a young black man with suspicion as he looked at power tools. Karen watched, her face growing pale. That's not what it looks like. The Johnson family has shopped here for years, and that young man was acting suspiciously." "What was suspicious about him?" Mark asked. "He kept picking things up and putting them down." "You mean shopping? Looking at products before deciding what to buy?" Karen glared at Mark. "You don't understand. This is a small town. We know our customers." "Not all of them," Mark said. "Not the ones you drive away." The tension in the tiny room was thick. Mike looked like he wanted to run, but he stayed, seated. "I don't have to listen to this," Karen finally said. "I'm calling Richard." "Good idea," Mark agreed. "We should all talk about this." Karen stormed out of the security office. Mike let out a long breath. "She's going to get me fired," he whispered. "No, she's not," Mark assured him. "Trust me on this." 20 minutes later, they were all gathered in Richard's office. Richard, Karen, Mark, and a very nervous Mike. Karen had just finished giving her version of events, painting Mark as an outsider who was overstepping his role. "He's accusing me of discrimination, Richard." Karen's voice quivered with anger. "After everything I've done for this store." Richard looked uncomfortable. "Mark, is this true? You're investigating Karen?" "I'm investigating store operations," Mark said calmly. "Customer service is part of that. And I've found some concerning patterns." "What patterns?" Richard asked. Mark explained what he had observed and what the security footage showed. Karen interrupted repeatedly, denying everything. Finally, Richard held up his hand. "Enough, both of you," he said. "Karen, please wait outside. I want to talk to Mark alone." "But Richard, please, Karen." After Karen left, shutting the door harder than necessary, Richard sighed deeply. "Is it really that bad?" he asked quietly. Mark nodded. "I'm afraid so. And it's hurting your business. People talk. Word gets around." Richard rubbed his temples. "Karen's family. My sister's daughter. I've known her since she was born." "I understand that makes this difficult," Mark said. "But this isn't just about Karen. It's about the future of Henderson's hardware." Richard looked up. "The new owner. Have you told him about all this?" Mark hesitated. "Not yet," he said carefully. "But he'll need to know, eventually." "This is such a mess," Richard groaned. "Maybe I should call off the sale, fix things myself." "You still want to retire, don't you?" Mark asked. Richard nodded. Yes, I'm too old for all this drama, but I care about the people who work here. Including Mike? And the customers Karen has been mistreating? Richard had the grace to look ashamed. I should have paid more attention, he admitted. I just trusted Karen to handle things. There was a knock at the door, and Tom poked his head in. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation out front. You might want to come. They followed Tom to the main floor. Karen was arguing loudly with a customer, a black man in his 30s wearing jeans and a t-shirt. With a jolt, Mark recognized himself. He was wearing the same casual clothes he'd worn on his first visit to the store. It took him a moment to realize what was happening. Karen didn't recognize him in these clothes. She thought he was just another customer. I've told you. Sir, that drill isn't on sale, Karen was saying, her voice tight. The price is clearly marked. But the sign says all power tools are 15% off this week, the man replied, pointing to a nearby display. That sale ended yesterday, Karen said, though Mark could see the sign clearly said the sale ran all week. Then maybe you should take down the sign, the man suggested. Karen's face hardened. If you don't like our pricing, you're welcome to shop elsewhere. Mark had heard enough. He stepped forward. What seems to be the problem here? Karen turned, startled to see Mark, the consultant Mark, on the sales floor. Mr. Johnson, I'm handling this. Please, I'd like to understand the situation, Mark insisted. The customer looked confused. The sign says there's a sale. She says there isn't. Mark looked at the sign, then at Karen. The sign does indicate a store-wide sale on power tools this week. There's been a mistake with the signage, Karen said, quickly. I was about to take it down. So you're refusing to honor your advertised price? Mark asked. I'm following store policy, Karen replied stiffly. By now, other customers had stopped to watch. Richard stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mike and Tom watched from behind a display. I think we should honor the advertised price, Mark said. It's good customer service. Karen's face flushed with anger. You don't make those decisions, Mr. Johnson. You're just a consultant. Something in Mark snapped. The weight of the past week, being thrown out of his own store, watching Karen mistreat customers, gathering evidence of discrimination, it all came to a head. Actually, Mark said, his voice carrying through the now silent store, I think I do get to make that decision. Karen stared at him. What are you talking about? Mark turned to the customer, to himself, and extended his hand. I apologize for the confusion about the sale. Of course we'll honor the advertised price. Then he faced Karen again. And to be clear, this customer is welcome in Henderson's Hardware. All customers are welcome here. Karen's eyes darted between Mark in his suit and the other Mark in casual clothes. Confusion crossed her face. I don't understand. Richard stepped forward, sensing something important was happening. Karen, what's going on? I'm not sure, Karen said slowly. But Mr. Johnson seems to think he can override my authority as manager. The tension in the store grew as more customers gathered to watch the scene unfold. Mark took a deep breath. The moment had come sooner than he'd planned, but perhaps it was for the best. I think, Mark said carefully, it's time for some honesty. The store had gone completely silent. Everyone waited for Mark to continue. Karen, Mark said, turning to face her directly. This isn't the first time I've been in this store. Karen frowned. What do you mean? You've been here all week. Before that, Mark said, I came in as a customer, wearing clothes just like this gentleman's. He gestured to the man Karen had been arguing with. And you treated me exactly the same way you're treating him now. Karen's face paled. I don't remember. You accused me of looking suspicious. Mark continued. You followed me around. Then you asked me to leave the store. Recognition dawned on Karen's face. That was you? Yes, Mark said. And after that happened, I asked friends of different races to visit this store. Guess what they found? White customers received friendly, helpful service. Customers of color were watched, questioned, or ignored. Richard stepped forward. Mark, I think we should discuss this in private. No, Mark said firmly. This has been private for too long. That's part of the problem. He looked around at the customers watching them. Henderson's Hardware should be a store that welcomes everyone, that serves the entire community. It does, Karen insisted, finding her voice again. I don't discriminate against anyone. The evidence says otherwise, Mark replied. Security footage, customer complaints you've hidden, community members who no longer shop here because of how they've been treated. Karen turned to Richard. Are you going to let him talk to me like this? He's just a consultant. Actually, Mark said, I'm not. Richard looked confused. What do you mean you're not a consultant? Mark took a deep breath. This was it. My name is Mark Johnson, and I'm the new owner of Henderson's Hardware. Gasps echoed through the store. Karen's mouth fell open. Richard stared in shock. I bought this store from Richard last month, Mark explained, addressing everyone. But before I took over officially, I wanted to see how it operated, how customers were treated, how the staff worked together. You lied to us? Karen stammered. I observed. Mark corrected her. And what I saw was a store with great potential, but serious problems. Mark turned to Richard. You knew I was coming this week to see the store operations, but you didn't know I planned to visit. As a customer first. Richard nodded slowly. I had no idea. He looked at Karen, then back at Mark. If I had known how Karen was treating people, you should have known, Mark said, not unkindly. It was happening in your store. Mike stepped forward. It's true. I tried to tell you about the complaints, but you never wanted to hear it. Karen looked betrayed. Mike? You knew about this? Not about Mr. Johnson being the owner, Mike said, but about how you treat certain customers. Everyone knows, Karen. Mark addressed the store again. Henderson's Hardware has been part of this community for over 50 years. It used to be a place where everyone felt welcome. I want to make it that way again. He walked over to the customer, who was actually Jamal, though nobody else knew that. Sir, I apologize for how you've been treated today. Your business is valued here. Jamal nodded, playing along. Thank you. I appreciate that. Mark looked around at all the curious faces watching him. Starting today, things will be different. At Henderson's Hardware, we'll honor all our advertised prices. We'll treat every customer with respect. And we'll build a team that reflects the diverse community we serve. Tom and Betty, who had joined the growing crowd, looked at each other with surprise. Mike was smiling broadly. Karen stood frozen, her face unreadable. Then she turned to Richard. Did you know he was black when you sold him the store? The question hung in the air, shocking in its bluntness. Karen, Richard gasped. Yes, he knew, Mark answered calmly. And it didn't matter to him, because what matters is my business experience and my vision for this store. Karen's eyes filled with tears. This is my store. It should have been mine. You wanted to buy it, Mark acknowledged. I know, but this isn't about ownership, Karen. It's about service, about community. You don't understand, Karen said, her voice breaking. This store is all I have. For a moment, Mark felt a twinge of sympathy. But he remembered all the people Karen had hurt, with her behavior. all the customers who no longer felt welcome. "Everyone, thank you for your patience," Mark announced. "The store will be closing early today. We'll reopen tomorrow with some exciting changes coming soon." As the customers filed out, Mark motioned for the staff to gather around him. "We'll have a proper meeting tomorrow morning. For now, please go home and think about the kind of store you want Henderson's Hardware to be." One by one, they left. Tom, Betty, and finally Mike, who gave Mark an encouraging nod. Soon, only Mark, Richard, and Karen remained. "Karen," Mark said gently, "we need to talk." Karen wiped her eyes and stood up straighter. For the first time, she looked directly at Mark, not as a suspicious customer or an interfering consultant, but as a person. And something in her expression changed, like she was seeing something familiar in his face. "Have we?" she began, then stopped. "You look like someone I used to know." I hope you enjoyed this story about Mark, Karen, and the powerful changes at Henderson's Hardware. Where are you listening from today? Drop your location in the comments below. If this story touched you or made you think, please hit that like button. Your support helps spread stories about understanding, growth, and community to more listeners. And if you're looking for another compelling story, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. It's hand-picked just for fans of this channel. Remember, small acts of kindness can transform communities, just like Mark set out to do with Henderson's Hardware. Until next time.